Hello, my name is Ben Hovland, and I'm a commissioner with the U.S. Election Assistance Commission, or EAC. As the Federal Clearinghouse on Election Administration, the EAC is working to provide information and resources for election officials and offering whatever support we can at the federal level to help state and local officials administer safe, secure, accessible, and accurate elections. Today's video chat is the first in a series focused on supporting new election officials. In the past 4 years, we've seen significant turnover in the field of elections. Many of the officials that have stepped up are not new to elections, but simply in a new role. For others, this will be their first presidential election. For U.S. election administrators, the intensity and turnout of a presidential election year are different than most other elections that officials run year in and year out. In this series, we will be addressing a number of critical topics, with today's discussion focused on election mail. We're fortunate to be joined by an excellent panel. I'd like to welcome Adrienne Marshall, who is the Executive Director for Election and Government Mail Services at the US Postal Service, or USPS. Brendan Donahue is the Assistant Inspector in charge for the United States Postal Inspection Service. And Tammy Patrick is the CEO for programs with the National Association of Election Officials, which is better known as the Election Center. Welcome all. Thank you for joining us. And I'm just going to jump into questions. Adrienne, could you tell us a little bit more about the USPS's election mail program and some of the offerings and resources that people might not be familiar with?
Absolutely, Ben. Thank you so much again for the invitation. Really happy to be here today. A little bit about my team. We were established in 2022, and we're a small team of 9, but we have a large cross-functional group of stakeholders who support us. And my team coordinate and centralize the activities around federal elections. We've got a lot of resources for election officials, and 2 of our greatest resources are USPS.com and Postal Pro. And so on those sites, there are resources that can be found on USPS.com and Postal Pro. Kit 600, which is our official election mail program kit that all of the jurisdictions should have seen. However, if for some reason they did not receive it, you can print that version from online. That kit provides the tools necessary to use the U.S. mail as a secure, efficient, and effective way to facilitate the election process. There's also Pub 631, which is the official election mail graphic guidelines and logos. If you can read that to learn about the proper use of the official election mail logo for your mail pieces. There's also Pub 632, which is State and Local Election Mail User's Guide. That's information that election officials must consider before mailing. There's also our most recent election and ballot mail STID finder, which is a tool designed to assist with selecting an appropriate election mail and ballot mail STID to assist with for your outbound mailings. Tag 191, which is the domestic and international ballots. It can be used by election officials to identify trays and sacks of ballot mail destined for other domestic and international military addresses. Note, tag 191 should not be used on sample ballots. We also have the official election mail logo. This logo serves to identify official election mail for Postal Service workers and distinguishes it from millions of other mail pieces that are processed daily. We also have our serialized intelligent mail barcodes. This is the 65 barcodes that simplifies data gathering by consolidating information from multiple Postal Service identifiers into one comprehensive location. And then our uniquely serialized IMBs facilitate the tracking of individual ballots to and from individual voters. We also have the election mail checkbox. This was created in Postal One in processing to get increased visibility of election mail in the mail stream. And if you check that box, it provides the Postal Service with important insight into election mail volume by entry point and it helps with our future Postal Service capacity planning. And then lastly, our ballot mail checkbox will be available starting July 14th of this year. Thank you.
No problem. Thank you. Those are a lot of great resources. Viewers, don't worry if you didn't get all those down. We're going to put some links in one place for you. So please check out those resources and appreciate that. Brendan, again, for our viewers who might not be as familiar with the United States Postal Inspection Service or USPIS, can you talk a little bit about USPIS's role in the election mail space and supporting election officials?
Yeah, first of all, thank you for the invitation to participate today. For those viewers and election officials who aren't familiar with the US Postal Inspection Service, it is the oldest federal law enforcement agency in the country, and we are the primary law enforcement, crime prevention, and security arm of the Postal Service. The Postal Inspection Service carries out its mission through its postal inspectors, uniformed postal police officers, and other professional and technical staff. We have local offices staffed in every state and most U.S. territories. We also have some personnel overseas. And primarily, we conduct investigations into violations of federal law in a broad range of areas, including mail theft, identity theft, fraud, dangerous mail, just to name a few. In regards to elections and supporting election officials, the Postal Inspection Service is committed to ensuring the safe and secure delivery of election mail to and from voters, the integrity of our elections, and the protection of election officials and election offices from threatening and dangerous mail. Specific to election security and the work that we do there, the Postal Inspection Service has a really long history of securing election mail dating back to the Civil War, and we continue to carry out that tradition today. Specifically, the unique status of election mail and also political mail makes its security a top priority for the Postal Inspection Service and the Postal Service. All 16 Postal Inspection Service field divisions have designated election security coordinators who coordinate the response to election security concerns, including those from local and state election officials. And notably, they coordinate election mail inspections within their divisions. If you're not familiar with election mail inspections, they were formerly known as observation of mail conditions, and they are a process and operational security measure. As part of the inspections, postal inspectors and other Postal Inspection Service personnel physically observe election mail processing and delivery operations. They review the physical security of election mail, including ballot mail and the workplace, and they report their findings to the Postal Inspection Service and Postal Service leadership so that corrective action may be taken for any concerns that are identified. As part of this process, they're also checking for processing and operational delays, which are also reported. The Postal Inspection Service works closely with the FBI, CISA, DHS, and the EAC on election security, including cybersecurity and infrastructure security. As part of these efforts, we regularly participate in election security tabletop exercises and welcome invitations to participate in local state election tabletop exercises. The Postal Inspection Service also regularly advises our local, state, and federal law enforcement partners on election security as it relates to election mail. Specific to election integrity, the Postal Inspection Service, we work with FBI, DOJ, USPS, OIG, and also local and state law enforcement when appropriate to respond to criminal allegations involving election security or election integrity. We also have personnel, election crimes coordinators who are located throughout the country, and their role is to coordinate with the Postal Inspection Service's election security coordinators and also to conduct outreach to local and state election officials on election security matters. And then finally, in regards to the protection of election officials from suspicious, threatening, and dangerous mail, Postal Inspection Service, we provide guidance to Postal Service managers and employees, but then also to local and state election officials and the election sector on the identification and reporting of suspicious mail destined for election offices and election officials. That guidance is available online at uspis.gov or also through the EAC or CISA or the FBI. And then the Postal Inspection Service, we also offer to local and state election officials free mailroom security screenings for local and state election offices. And then finally, the Postal Inspection Service also responds to and investigates incidents involving suspicious, threatening, and dangerous mail. And we often do this in partnership with our local, state, and federal law enforcement partners, and often in response to reports from local and state election officials. We maintain a hotline for the reporting of election mail security and criminal incidents and the reporting of suspicious, threatening, or dangerous mail. And that phone number is 877-876-2455, and reports can be made 24/7.
Thank you for that. That's great. You know, I know when I first learned about USPIS, it was great to know there was another law enforcement entity out there that works on these issues, specializes on postal issues, obviously has access, to information about the mail that many others might not, and so appreciate that work. Tammy, welcome. I've got a good one for you. For folks watching this, I feel like Tammy's forgotten more about election mail than I'll ever know, but so that's why she's here. So Tammy, hypothetically, if you were a new election official or this was your first presidential election cycle, what would you want to be sure you knew about election mail?
Thank you so much, Commissioner. I think that my one of my nicknames in the past has been the Postal Whisperer, and I think I'm maybe the most proud of that particular moniker. So I was thinking about this question, and we expect a lot of our election officials. There's a lot of federal laws, state laws, local administrative policies. And so now, in addition to all of that, we want you to understand Postal Service regulations and processes and procedures. But there are three really key things that I think those who are new to the field, or maybe those who are seeing an uptick in participation through voting by mail or absentee voting, three big things to know and to keep in mind. And the first is relationships and resources. The second, visibility and design. And then lastly, setting the right expectation. So when I talk about relationships and resources, here we are, right? We've got the EAC, you've got USPS, you've got USPIS, you've heard about the resources that are available, and those relationships are critical. So making sure that you know who your local postmaster is, that you know who to contact if you have a suspicious package or mailing that is potentially problematic. Knowing who to contact is really important because you have a support network there. It's also important to know, for those of you who might be new, is that your state associations, your chief election official, whether they're the Secretary of State or a state board of elections, or if you're a member of the election center, there might be postal committees that you can be members of. And that's how I've been able to know all of you over the past few years. So those relationships are really critical in making sure that everyone is on the right page around what is important when it comes to serving our voters, using the mail, and what I often refer to as delivering democracy. So the second piece is that visibility and design. And the visibility in the mail stream, those of you who might know me know that when I hear tag 191, my heart goes pitter-pat. That's part of the visibility in the mail stream. And election officials, we all love color coding. We love our checklists. So when Adrienne talks about check boxes and we talk about green tag 191s or all of these various aspects, just like election officials organize their work products and their workflows, that's what the Postal Service is doing. So we need to make sure that we know what we can do to help them serve us and our voters well. So think about visibility. Think about making sure you're using the logo. Use the intelligent mail barcodes or the IMBs. Think about that green tag 191. And if you post pictures on social media, you're sure to get a retweet from me. The last piece is setting expectations. And for years now, the Postal Service has been kind of shifting their network for more than a decade, because let's face it, there's been changes in the way that the public send information and communicate with one another. And so the Postal Service has been revisiting their network. So it's definitely the case that our mail may not just be going across town anymore. It might be going to processing plants. It might be going to, a greater distance than it did 10 years ago. So making sure our voters know what the expectation is for making early applications for ballots, sending in registration forms before the deadline, getting those ballots back in the mail if that's how they're choosing to return them well in advance. We need to set those expectations so that we can ensure that our voters can be successful. And I will say for those who are watching, there are some states where their laws are not aligned with this expectation. If you allow a voter to request a ballot on Friday for Tuesday's election, or even allow them to request it on Monday for the next election day, that is not setting up the voter for success. And so when voters call and ask what the deadline is, if you tell them Monday, that they may not be successful. So make sure you let them know that the legal requirement is Monday, but it's best if you make that request as early as possible, because the Postal Service usually recommends to get the ballot back in the mail 1 week before it's due. So I think those three things: relationships and resources, visibility and design. Take a look at your envelopes. Make sure you're sending them to the design specialist, because oftentimes the problems we encounter, it isn't necessarily a problem with the Postal Service or even with election workers. Sometimes it's those design requirements on the envelope, and then set the right expectation.
Thank you for that, Tammy. Actually, you hit on a big one there that I wanted to ask Adrienne about, and so thanks for teeing it up here. Adrienne, Tammy just mentioned Mailpiece design, and obviously that is a critical component to ensure that election mail flows the way it's supposed to. Can you talk a little bit more about this and how people can connect with the Mailpiece design specialists from the USPS?
Absolutely. And that was really great information that Tammy provided. She is an expert, right? But to ensure that mail pieces meet the Postal Service's mailing standards and can be processed on our automated equipment, a mail piece design analyst, which we often refer to as an MDA, has been assigned to assist in each locality. So we strongly recommend that state and local officials work with the Postal Service before designing and printing any mail piece for use in elections. So for assistance in customers that need to connect with an MDA, they can email the MDAs at mda@usps.gov, or they can call the 800 number at 877-672-0007. They can select option 2 for mailing and shipping, and then option 2 again will take them to an MDA. Their hours of operation are Monday through Friday, 7 a.m. to 7 p.m. Central Time. And in line with our retail and delivery units, they're closed on federal holidays. Also, there's mail piece design information available online, and I also provide that link, as you said, Commissioner, earlier. And then lastly, just go back and review that Pub 631, the official election mail graphics, guidelines, and logos, a great resource to learn about the proper use of the logo and mail piece design and all the information that you would need. But very good question, and a very important part of the election process.
Thank you for that. Yeah, I know so many times when we hear stories or when folks look into what was happening, it's something that originated with that design, and so we know that matters and appreciate that information. Brendan, wanted to come back to you. Unfortunately, there have been some white powder mail incidents have made headlines already this election cycle. I know we've done some work together on this issue, but I was hoping you could talk about some of the precautions that offices can take in advance to mitigate the impact of a potential incident, and then what steps people should take if they have a suspicious piece of mail in their office.
Yeah, good question, and more than happy to provide that guidance. Before I do, I want to note that over the past 4 years, and even prior to that, election officials have reported being threatened or harassed. And one of the means by which that happens is through the mail. It is certainly not the most prevalent, but it is a way that happens. And so it's important that election officials be prepared in the event that they or their office receives threatening, dangerous, or suspicious mail. And so I think the first point would be that election officials or election offices should have a plan, and they should have that plan in place. And employees in that office should all know what that plan is in the event that the office receives a threat or something dangerous, regardless of whether that's via the mail or some other form of communication. Specific to the mail, though, as you noted earlier this year and during this election cycle, there have been a number of incidents involving suspicious threatening and dangerous mail sent to election offices and election officials. In February 2024, the Postal Inspection Service with the FBI, CISA, and also the Election Assistance Commission, we issued a joint guidance document, Election Mail Handling Procedures to Protect Against Hazardous Materials. This document lays out a number of common sense recommendations for election offices and election officials specific to handling of mail and how to respond if suspicious, threatening, or dangerous mail is identified. They're low cost, no cost. It can be implemented by an election office regardless of the size of it, whether it's a big office or a small office, and I think that's important to note. Specific to that recommendation, the recommendations that are within that guidance document really break it down into 3 categories: prepare, identify, respond. First, specific to prepare, really there should be some consideration given to the mail handling location for election offices. Recommend that occur towards the exterior of a building, if that is available, and that it occur in one central location, again, if possible, as opposed to it being in a central location or in multiple locations throughout the building. Also recommend the adoption and use of personal protective equipment, masks, nitrile gloves. Also recommend consideration of Narcan being on hand for an election office for use by employees in the event that it is needed. And specific to that, recommend that you have discussions with your local or state public health officials and local emergency officials to determine if that's right for you. Also recommend having those conversations with local and state public health officials to know the facts about fentanyl and other threatening and suspicious or dangerous substances that are potentially sent through the mail, such as anthrax or ricin. Then the next category, identify, really recommend that employees have awareness of the identification of common characteristics of suspicious mail. The Postal Inspection Service, along with DHS, FBI, and ATF, have what we call Poster 84. And this poster lays out a number of those characteristics, some of which in of themselves may be indicative of suspicious mail, but for an election office, some of them may not be. And so recommend taking those characteristics in the totality of the circumstances. So some of those common indicators include no return address, restrictive markings, improper spelling, poorly wrapped or excessive tape, unknown powder or suspicious substances on the outside of the envelope, excessive postage, or unexpected mail from a foreign country. Again, some of these for an election office in and of themselves may not be suspicious, especially, for example, with overseas voters. But if that package or letter is also leaking an unknown powder, hopefully that would be cause for concern and then ultimately result in contact to emergency officials. Which then leads me to the next point in that guidance, respond. We make a number of recommendations here in terms of that response. Call 911. Your local and state emergency response officials are the most important people to contact first. Then employees should avoid actions that would cause the substance, if they encounter one, to become airborne. Leave the area and warn others about that substance. Do not touch your eyes, mouth, nose, or skin. Remove contaminated clothing. Wash skin with cool water and soap. And then account for all people who are exposed and keep together. And ultimately avoid direct contact with others until local responders have responded and provided with that decontamination or clearance to have further contact. And then finally, report to the US Postal Inspection Service and the FBI. We still want you to report to us, but that should be after local and state emergency responders have been contacted. Again, these are just some of those recommendations. The guidance document that guides the response and the handling of mail and the response to potentially hazardous materials can be found at the EAC's website, the Postal Inspection Service's website, USPIS.gov, CISA's website, or the FBI website. Same as Poster 84 that's available at the Postal Inspection Service's website, and really encourage local and state election officials to adopt the recommendations made in this guidance document.
Thank you for that important information, Brendan. Tammy, I had wanted to come back to you. You've long been a proponent and supporter of electionmail.org. Can you talk a little bit about that and how people can utilize it if they're having issues?
Yeah, so it's tough to follow such a sobering conversation around the potential security and health ramifications of getting, mail package. And in the same way that the relationships are so important, if some incident like that occurs where to contact your local your local law enforcement first, and then follow up with federal officials. That's where electionmail.org comes in. If you have other types of concerns or questions around addressing, delivery, NCOA, there's a wide variety of categories of concerns you might have. You always want to try and first address that with your local postmaster, your local offices. If, however, they don't have the answer for you, or you're not getting an answer, if they're unresponsive, electionmail.org is a resource that we started, I think it was back in 2018. Now it's already been almost 5 years. So 6 years. I mean, I can't do math. We started it because we would go to election center events and other events, and people would stand up and say, well, I had a problem. And when we would try to learn more about it, it would turn out it was a problem 3 elections ago. Well, that doesn't provide you with any actionable information to be able to make things better. Imagine election officials, and you had this happen, I know you have, you're out at a public event, a voter comes up and tells you they had a bad experience, but they can't tell you what polling place they were at. They can't tell you what the poll worker's name was, or what they looked like, or what even the real issue was. So we wanted to have a repository and a mechanism in place so that election officials could inform the Postal Service about challenges and issues that they were having in real time. So electionmail.org was created, and within a couple of months, the Postal Service asked if we could have it be a bridge directly into their reporting system. So it is definitely a place where election officials, not voters, but election officials, can directly reach out to the Postal Service and have their incident be routed to the correct department. So if it's an addressing problem or challenge, it might be routed directly to the Memphis addressing issue or addressing office. Or if it's a challenge with their mail design, it would go to that department. But the good news is that Adrienne sees all of them. The maybe not so good news is I see them too. And so I keep an eye on it. And when I see things that are not just the 1 and 2 off instances where one voter says they didn't get their ballot, the wife did, but the husband didn't, or one person in the household didn't, and others didn't. We need to have information that allows the Postal Service to figure out what happened in those instances, and that's where ballot tracking becomes so critical. So the electionmail.org service is really there to try and capture the information so that we can identify if it is a problem with the envelope design, or if it is an issue with a mail vendor, right? It can happen where they put the wrong information on it, or use the wrong indicia, or if it is a problem with the Postal Service. We need to know before we make any assumptions of what the problems are, so that we can remedy it, hopefully within that same election cycle, but if not for that election, for that voter, for future elections and for future voters.
Thank you for that, Tammy. We know that's a great resource and an important way to report issues. You mentioned that sometimes that might not be your first place to go, and that you should hopefully have that local relationship. Along those lines, this one, I guess, for both Adrienne and Brendan, if election officials are having an issue related to election mail, such as ballots lost in transit or suspicious mails we're talking about, who should that point of contact be, and where can election officials find that information? Adrienne, if you want to start.
Sure. Thank you. And Tammy talked a lot about relationships, and I was really happy to hear that she brought up how to report issues through electionmail.org. I do see all of those that come through. But the relationships, again, are very important. Your local postmaster is a really good resource, in addition to your primary point of contact, who are the managers of customer relations. And we have 50, and each one of the election officials should know who their point of contact is. And so for a list of your manager of customer relations in your area, it can also be found, that list can be found on USPS.com. And you can just cue right in to see who that person is. But in addition to your local postmaster, of course, your manager of customer relations. And I'll let Brendan talk about how to report the suspicious activity.
Yeah, and just to reinforce for the reporting of election mail security and criminal incidents, please report those directly to the Postal Inspection Service at 877-876-2455. Those incidents involving a criminal matter or a security matter should not be reported through electionmail.org. And then for all urgent incidents, including threatening or dangerous mail or those that involve life and safety, please remember to call 911 first and contact your local emergency responders.
Thank you. Adrienne, I wanted to come back to you. Another thing that Tammy hit on earlier, but just wanted to hit on again. You know, election officials are often asked by their voters or give voters general guidance about when they should mail ballots so they're received by the deadline. You know, again, we know there have been, as Tammy mentioned, some shifts in service. Do you have any additional guidance for how early ballots need to be mailed to ensure they're received by the deadline? Is the week that Tammy mentioned the right number? I'm sure it is, Tammy. But
yeah, and then Tammy talked about, you know, our network transformation and modernization of our facilities. So of course we have that huge task going on. But in jurisdictions that require eligible voters to request a ballot in order to receive one through the mail, we recommend that domestic non-military voters request their ballot as early as their jurisdiction allows. Some jurisdictions, including vote by mail states, generally do not require eligible voters to request a ballot in order to receive one. But for domestic and non-military voters who choose to use the mail to return their completed ballot, the Postal Service recommends that they mail their completed ballot before Election Day. And I'm going to mention this again, that Tammy's at least 1 week before the deadline, by which their completed ballot must be received by their local election official. So some states may recommend allowing even more time for mailing completed ballots. Election officials should consider advising voters about the Postal Service's recommendation. Now, for military and diplomatic personnel serving overseas, such as Army and Air Force, post office, diplomatic post office, as we say, APOs, FPOs, and DPO voters must follow the return by mail date for those locations.
Well, that's good information. I know, you know, it happens. I've been that person that has filled out my ballot and it's sitting on my home office on my desk, and I mean to get it in the mail, and you just get a little bit close. So it's good to give people that heads up and give them the time to make sure it gets delivered. Switching a little bit, Tammy, I wanted to come back to you. You know, I think about, of course, 2020, we saw record amounts of mail. My prediction here is it's going to be less than 20, the mail volume in 2020 for election mail, but more than 2016, more than we've seen in any year other than 2020. So based on your past experience as a former election official, do you have any tips for officials as they plan for a volume of election mail that they'll need to process that may be more than they've seen?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think you're right in your prophesizing and projections. So one thing to remember and to think about when people have concerns around the volume of election mail and whether or not the Postal Service can possibly serve all of these voters, absolutely they can. Volume is not an issue. Election mail is a fraction of the billions of mail pieces that they process yearly. And what I recommend to election officials when they're talking to voters, if voters voice that concern, is just to bring it back home to your own kitchen table and think about you have one ballot versus all the political mail that you get in any given election. So the mail volume itself is not going to be a problem for the Postal Service to make sure that things get delivered appropriately. There are a couple of things, though, that we want to make sure election officials are thinking about, and that is in the relationships that they have with their local postmasters, setting the right expectation around when they're going to be mailing out their ballots, when those ballots are coming back in. If they're going to use business reply mail, they want to talk to their local postmaster about how the BRM, business reply mail, is going to get processed, when it's going to get processed, if they're going to wait until they have a full tray, or if they're going to do it every day, even if there's only 10 ballots that come in. Talk about the specific logistics around how those ballots are going to be processed locally. For small jurisdictions, if you have your mail delivered by your postal carrier, pulls it out of their sack or out of their cart, talk about potentially doing some sort of a caller service or a PO box so you can go and pick it up. Because that can be helpful in the timeliness of capturing the mail. The other piece that's going to be really important is making sure that voters understand around postmarks, because there might be an assumption that a postmark is a valid way of demonstrating that the ballot was mailed back in time, and maybe your state doesn't allow for postmarks. So make sure your voters understand that, and that your messaging and instructions to voters are really clear about whether a postmark is valid or not. The other piece is, if you do allow for a postmark, make sure that voters know that if they're procrastinator like Commissioner Ben Hovland, they can take that postmark or their ballot into a local post office in postmark states and ask to have it be hand canceled or round stamped. So it'll make sure that it gets postmarked and that the ballot gets counted. For the election officials trying to gauge their own internal processing of the volume of mail that might be coming, there are some resources available. So we've talked a little bit about ballot tracking. That helps you to know what is in the mail stream coming into your office. Do you need to bring in additional temps? Will you need to have a second shift? Will you need to have some additional overtime attributed? Making sure that you have a service that's called informed visibility is another way of having an understanding around what mail volume is coming into your office so that you can plan accordingly. So the good news is that we don't necessarily know how our voters are going to decide they want to participate in 2024. Will they choose to vote by mail? Will they choose to vote early in person or go to the polls on Tuesday? Either way, no matter what they decide to do, we have federal partners standing by to help local and state election officials in serving those voters, no matter what process they've decided to use, given whatever options they have available in their state.
Thank you for that. I got one final question here, and it's for everybody. So we'll start with Adrienne. We'll go in the order that I introduced you all in, but essentially, we're just a few months away from the November election. Obviously, there's still state primaries in a number of states, but at this point in the cycle, any parting thoughts or recommendations that you would have for election officials on steps that they can still take to improve their election mail experience and that of their voters? Adrienne, if you want to start with that.
Yeah, thank you again, Commissioner. We've had such a healthy discussion today, a lot of information. I'm going to lean into what Tammy talked about earlier with relationships and expectations. And I'm going to say it's also important that you plan ahead and plan early. I encourage those relationships again with your postmasters and of course with your primary points of contact, your manager of customer relations. But from our role with the election process, and of course that is to collect, transport, and deliver the nation's election mail, and we're very committed to timely doing that again this year. When election officials choose to use the mail as part of their election process, or if a voter chooses to use the mail to cast their vote, I just want to say again that it's safe, it's secure, and it's efficient. We have the infrastructure and the capacity, so the volume is just a small representation of the billions of pieces of mail that we process. And, we touch 163 million addresses a day. So we're able and ready. But thank you for asking.
Thank you. I remember when the volume came up in 2020, and somebody said to me, "Yeah, you think that's a lot? You should see what we get on Mother's Day."
Right? Or Christmas, right?
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Appreciate that. Brendan, same question, just sort of, I guess, last minute tips or suggestions or thoughts that people still have time to implement.
Yeah, two things. I want to reinforce the encouragement of election offices and election officials to implement the election mail handling procedures to protect against hazardous materials that I mentioned before. There's still plenty of time to implement these recommendations, and they will help protect your election offices and your employees. Again, they're low cost, no cost, common sense, and they work. The second thing, I want to encourage election offices and election officials to liaise and develop a relationship with your local Postal Inspection Service Election Crimes Coordinator, and also your FBI Election Crimes Coordinator and your local and state law enforcement. It's best to establish these relationships before a security or criminal incident happens, and we're there for you, and we're there to be a resource for you as well. So please encourage local and state election officials to develop those relationships now before November.
Thank you. And Tammy.
Yeah, lastly, I would say if you're going to be making any changes, because some of you still have legislatures in session that are having dictates come down, or there's litigation that might make a change, any changes that you're doing to the way in which you're mailing out materials or receiving them back, whether it's you're now going to prepay or postage paid, or you're going to have to change an envelope, make sure you're checking in with the Postal Service about those changes. If you need anything like green tag 191s, you can actually order those on the website, on the Postal Service's website. So make sure you take a look at their website, review the kit 600 that was mentioned, because there's really a lot of information there, and we need to do what we can to help our federal partners in delivering the mail to our voters. So make sure you're using that official election mail logo. It is a great touch point when there are other mailers that go out that try to look like their official mail. Having that logo on it is the only thing that distinguishes an official mail piece from the elections office from something that's trying to look official. And so you want to make sure that you're covering your bases by using the logo so that you can use that in your outreach to voters to point to what is real information and not potentially mis or dis or malinformation.
Thank you for that. And really, I want to thank all of you for joining me today. This has been a really valuable conversation. The EAC has links to the resources mentioned in this video and others to support election officials. And so encourage you all the viewers to check those out. Thank you all for watching, and please check out the other videos in this series. And thank you all for helping Americans to vote.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.